The Silent Century. The last salt miner who walked the lowest chamber under Detroit. What he found behind the wall. 1,200 feet below the city of Detroit, there is a network of tunnels that almost nobody is allowed to enter. The Detroit salt mine has been operating since 1906. It covers more than 1,500 acres beneath the city, with over 100 miles of roads carved through solid rock salt that geologists say was deposited 400 million years ago. The official tours stop at a controlled section near the surface. Visitors see polished walls, neatly cut chambers, mining equipment on display. They are told a clean, simple story about industrial extraction, 20th century engineering, and the geology of an ancient seabed. They are not shown the lower chambers. They are not told about the deeper levels, the sealed corridors, or the sections of the mine that were quietly walled off in the 1960s and never reopened. In 2007, a former miner named Ellis Cardew, who had worked underground in Detroit for 31 years, sat down with a regional historian in a diner in Dearborn, Michigan. He was 68 years old. He had been retired for 3 years. He ordered black coffee and a plate of toast that he never touched. And he told the historian that he had been one of the last men to walk through what the older miners called the lowest chamber, a section of the mine that was decommissioned and sealed before he reached his second year of employment, and that what he and his crew had found behind a wall in that chamber in the spring of 1976 was not described in any geological survey, not listed in any company record, and was the reason, in his belief, that an entire section of the Detroit salt mine had been quietly removed from the working maps for nearly 50 years. The historian, a man named Foster Lebrun, had been investigating the mine's institutional history for an academic project. He recorded the conversation. The recording exists. It runs for 2 hours and 17 minutes. Cardew describes in detail the chamber, the wall, what was behind the wall, and what happened to the 3 other men who had been with him that day. By the end of the conversation, Cardew tells Lebrun that he is the only one of the 4 still alive. He says one of the others died in a car accident in 1981. One died of what was officially described as a heart attack in his early 40s in 1984, and the third left the company in 1978 and was never heard from again. Cardew says he believes none of those deaths were natural. 2 months after the interview, in February of 2008, Ellis Cardew was found dead in his apartment. The cause of death was listed as a fall. He had no surviving spouse. His personal papers were collected by a nephew who lived in Ohio. The recording stayed in Foster Lebrun's possession until Lebrun himself died in 2019, at which point it was donated with the rest of his research files to a small archive in Michigan that does not catalogue its holdings publicly. What did Ellis Cardew see behind that wall, and why does the answer connect not just to the strange architecture of an industrial salt mine, but to a much larger question about what was actually buried beneath the cities of the American Midwest before the cities were ever built? Because once you start looking, the Detroit mine is not an isolated case. It is one node in a pattern that runs from Ohio to Kansas to upstate New York, a pattern of underground chambers, sealed corridors, and decommissioned mines that the official record describes as ordinary industrial sites, and that the men who actually worked them describe as something else entirely. This is a deep dive into one of the most quietly buried stories in American industrial history, and into the question of what the older world looked like before the official version was poured over the top of it. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, the kind of story that the people in charge would prefer you never saw, subscribe to the channel. We do this every week. We go where the official record won't. To understand what Cardew described, you have to first understand what the Detroit salt mine actually is. The official story is straightforward. In 1895, geologists confirmed that beneath the city of Detroit there was an enormous deposit of rock salt, the remains of a shallow inland sea that had evaporated hundreds of millions of years ago. The Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company began sinking a shaft in 1896. The shaft reached the salt deposit In 1906, mining began. By 1922, a second company, the Detroit Rock Salt Company, had taken over operations. Through the 20th century, the mine grew into one of the largest underground industrial sites in the United States, producing primarily road salt for the highway systems of the upper Midwest. That is the version on the company brochures. That is the version in the local history museums. That is the version you will find if you read the Wikipedia entry. What is not on the brochures and what the museums do not display is the fact that the mine surveying records from the period between 1909 and roughly 1932 are largely missing. The Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company filed reports with the state of Michigan and with federal authorities about its tonnage, its workforce, and its safety conditions. But the detailed three-dimensional surveys of the actual chambers being excavated, which would have been routine engineering documentation, are not in any public archive. The company changed hands multiple times. Records were transferred, lost, or quietly removed. By the time a serious historical inventory was attempted in the 1970s, the surveying record had a roughly 23-year gap. Nobody could tell you with certainty what the early chambers had looked like, what their dimensions were, or what had been encountered when they were dug. This matters because Cardew, in his interview with LeBron, said that the older miners, the ones who had been hired in the 1940s and who had worked alongside men who had been there since the 1920s, had a saying. They said that the company did not dig the lowest chamber, the company found it. Cardew said this had been told to him as a kind of joke when he was first hired in 1972. He had laughed at it. He had assumed it was the kind of folklore that long-term workers passed down to new hires. He stopped laughing in 1976. In April of that year, Cardew and 3 other miners were assigned to a routine inspection of a section of the mine that had been listed on the working maps as decommissioned. The official reason for the inspection was a structural concern. There had been minor seismic activity in the region the previous month, and the company wanted to verify that the supports in older sections were still intact. Cardew said the section they were sent to was not on the standard tour. It was not on the maps that were given to ordinary mining crews. It was on a separate, older map that was kept in the supervisor's office, and that, according to the supervisor who briefed them that morning, was the only copy. The 4 men descended in an elevator that took them past the working levels and continued downward. Cardew said the elevator went deeper than he had ever been. He said the air changed. He said the temperature, which in the working sections of the mine was a constant 58 degrees, rose noticeably as they descended. This, in itself, was strange. Salt mines, by their geology, do not get warmer as you go deeper. The temperature is determined by the surrounding rock, and the surrounding rock at this depth should have been the same temperature as the rock above it. But Cardew said the deeper chamber felt warmer, and he said the older miner who was leading the team, a man named Patrick Hennig, did not seem surprised. When the elevator stopped, they walked through a corridor that had been cut, Cardew said, with surfaces too clean for industrial mining. The walls were not the rough, blasted texture of a typical salt mine tunnel. They were smooth. They were, in his words, like the inside of a polished bowl. He said the corridor curved gently, in a way that did not match any of the angular grid pattern excavation that was used in modern mining. It felt, he said, like walking through a tunnel that had been built rather than blasted. Hennig, the older man, told them not to comment on it. He said the company had explanations for the geometry. He said the explanations were on file. Cardew, looking back, said he had never seen those explanations and that nobody he asked in the years afterward had ever seen them either. The corridor opened into a chamber. Cardew described the chamber as roughly the size of a small church, perhaps 80 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose to maybe 40 feet at its highest point. The chamber was empty, except for a wall on the far side that did not match the rest of the room. The wall, he said, was made of a material that was not salt. It was darker. It had a faint sheen. It was set into the salt of the chamber, sealing off what appeared to be a passageway. There was no industrial signage. There were no marker plates. There was no record of who had built the wall or when. Hennig told them they were going to remove a section of it. The structural inspection, he said, required them to verify what was on the other side. The 4 men had brought tools. They began to work. Cardew said it took them most of the day to break through. The wall was thicker than it looked, and the material did not respond to their tools the way salt or concrete would have. He said it was harder. He said it had a kind of resistance that, in his words, felt almost living. By the late afternoon they had opened a section roughly 4 feet across. Hennig was the first to put a light through the gap. He looked, he stepped back, and he told the other 3 men, in a voice that Cardew described as careful, to come and see. What was on the other side of the wall, according to Cardew's testimony to Lebrun, was not a passageway. It was another chamber, larger than the one they had entered, and it was not empty. There were structures inside it. Cardew described them as columns. He said they were arranged in 2 rows running away from the opening into the depth of the chamber. He said the columns were not made of salt. They were not made of any material he recognized. They had a texture and a color that he struggled to describe even more than 30 years later. He said the columns were marked. There were lines on them, grooves, what looked to him, in the light of his miner's lamp, like writing. But the writing, if it was writing, was not in any alphabet he had ever seen. It was angular. It was deeply cut. It ran in vertical lines down the length of each column. Beyond the columns, deeper into the chamber, Cardew could see what he described as the outline of a larger structure, something that looked, in his words, like the front of a building. There was a doorway. There was a kind of frame around the doorway. He could not see what was beyond it because the light from the gap in the wall did not reach that far. He said he stood there looking for what felt like a long time. He said Hennig stood next to him and said nothing. The other 2 men behind them also said nothing. Then, Cardew said, Hennig stepped back from the gap and told them they were finished for the day. He said the company would handle it from there. He said they were to seal the gap, return to the elevator, and not discuss what they had seen with anyone. Cardew said he asked Hennig what the columns were. Hennig did not answer. Cardew said he asked again, and Hennig said in a quiet voice that they had not been the first crew to find it, and they would not be the last, and that the company had a procedure. The 4 men sealed the gap. Cardew said they used a temporary patching compound that he later realized was not standard mining equipment. It had been brought down with them in a sealed container that Hennig had carried personally. The patching compound hardened within minutes. By the time they left the chamber, the wall looked as it had when they arrived, except for a faint outline where the new section had been added. They returned to the surface. They were told that their inspection report should describe a routine structural survey with no findings of concern. Cardew said he wrote the report exactly as he was told. He said all 4 men signed it. He said within a week the lowest chamber had been removed from the working maps entirely. There was no reference to the structural inspection. There was no record of the day they had spent below. Hennig, the older miner who had led the team, retired 3 months later. Cardew said Hennig had been planning to work another 5 years, but something had changed after that day. Hennig moved out of state. He died in 1981 in a car accident on a stretch of highway in northern Michigan that Cardew said he had driven dozens of times without incident. The report said Hennig had fallen asleep at the wheel. Cardew said Hennig had been the most careful driver he had ever known. The second miner on the team, a man named Russ Kohler, died in 1984 of what was officially recorded as a heart attack. He was 43. He had no history of heart disease. The third miner, Davis Ullman, left the Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company in 1978 and, according to Cardew, simply disappeared from the social network of the mining community. Letters to his last known address went unanswered. Family members, when contacted, said they did not know where he was. Cardew said Ullman had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to vanish. That left Cardew. For nearly 30 years after the incident, he said nothing. He continued to work in the mine. He was promoted. He moved from cutting crews to safety inspection. He never returned to the lowest level, and he was never asked to. He retired in 2004, and then in 2007 he decided that he had carried the story long enough, and he reached out to Foster Lebrun, whose work he had read in a regional historical journal, and he asked if Lebrun would be willing to listen. Now, before we go further, let me address the obvious question. Is any of this real? Because we have, again, a story that exists primarily through fragments. We have a recording in a private archive. We have a man who is dead. We have a wall in a mine that nobody is allowed to see. The skeptical position is reasonable. Cardew could have invented the whole thing. Lebrun could have been deceived, or he could have embellished. The recording could be fabricated. These are all possibilities. But here is what makes it harder to dismiss. The Detroit salt mine is not the only site like this. Across the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes region, there are at least a dozen industrial extraction sites where the underground architecture does not match the standard explanation. There is the Retzoff salt mine in upstate New York, which collapsed catastrophically in 1994 in a way that the official geological survey could not initially explain. There is the Hutchinson salt mine in Kansas, which has chambers that, in old photographs from the 1930s, show wall surfaces and structural features that do not match the geology of evaporite deposits. There is the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Range in Michigan, where miners in the 1960s reported encountering what they described as worked stone at depths that should have been pre-Cambrian rock. In each case, the reports were filed, dismissed, and the sites were either restructured or sealed. The pattern is consistent. Underground extraction operations begin. The miners encounter something that does not fit the textbook explanation. The reports are quietly suppressed. The sites are renamed, restructured, or closed. The official record proceeds as if nothing unusual was ever found, and the men who actually saw what was down there either die, disappear, or remain silent for decades. There is one more piece of corroboration that deserves attention, because it does not come from the recording, and it does not come from Cardew at all. In 2014, a retired safety engineer named Bernard Holcomb gave a short interview to a podcast that focused on regional industrial history. Holcomb had worked for the Michigan Department of Labor in the 1970s and had been responsible for inspecting underground mining operations in the Detroit area. He was 81 when the interview was recorded. He said on tape that he had been called to the Detroit Salt and Manufacturing Company's main office in May of 1976, roughly 3 weeks after the date Cardew had described. He said he had been told by a senior company official that there had been an internal inspection of a decommissioned section of the mine, and that the company wanted his department to formally close the section in the state's records. Holcomb said the official did not allow him to inspect the section himself. He was given a one-page summary, asked to sign it, and told that the matter was confidential. He signed, he filed the paperwork. He thought about it for the rest of his career. He said in the interview that he had assumed at the time that the company was hiding a structural problem and did not want the liability. He said he no longer believed that. He said the official who had handed him the paperwork had not looked like a man worried about liability. He had looked like a man who had been instructed by someone above him to make a problem disappear, and who did not want to know any more about the problem than he already did. Holcomb died in 2017. The podcast episode was archived briefly and then removed from the host's main feed, though copies still circulate in private collections. Holcomb's testimony, given more than 7 years after Cardew's recording was made, lines up with Cardew's account on every checkable detail. This is where the story connects to a larger question, because if you study the history of North American settlement, particularly the period between roughly 1750 and 1850, you find a series of accounts that do not fit the standard narrative. You find newspaper articles from small regional papers in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and New York that describe the discovery of underground structures during the construction of canals, railroads, and city foundations. The articles describe stone walls. They describe metal artifacts. They describe what the writers, in the language of the period, called the works of an older race. The articles appeared in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and into the 1850s. They were written by editors who had no apparent reason to invent the stories. They described specific locations, specific witnesses, specific dimensions of the structures that had been found. And then, beginning in roughly the late 1860s and accelerating into the 1880s and 1890s, the report stopped. Not because the discoveries stopped, the construction of cities continued, excavations continued, foundations were dug. But the newspapers stopped reporting the anomalous findings. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been founded in 1846, became the official repository for archaeological materials, and a generation of researchers who had been documenting the underground architecture of the Midwest were quietly displaced by a new academic establishment that defined the official prehistory of North America in much narrower terms. The mound builders became the Adena and Hopewell cultures, dated to specific periods and assigned specific origins. Anything that did not fit this framework was either reclassified, dismissed as misidentification, or simply not collected. The Detroit salt mine, in this larger context, is not just a story about a peculiar wall in a peculiar chamber. It is a piece of evidence in a much longer pattern. Because if the standard archaeological timeline of North America is correct, then there should be no worked structures, no columned chambers, no inscribed pillars beneath the city of Detroit at a depth of 1,200 feet. The salt deposits at that depth are, according to the geological record, 400 million years old. There were no human civilizations on this continent 400 million years ago. There were not even mammals. The standard explanation for what Cardew described, if you accept that he is telling the truth, is therefore impossible. But what if the standard explanation is wrong? What if the salt deposits are not as old as the textbooks claim? What if the geology of the Great Lakes region has been more recently disturbed than the official record suggests? What if there were civilizations in North America that the modern academic establishment has, for reasons of its own, chosen not to recognize? These are the questions that have been raised, dismissed, and raised again by independent researchers, by amateur historians, by miners and excavators and engineers who have actually been underground and who have seen things that the textbooks say should not be there. This is where the Tartaria question enters. Because the broader hypothesis, and you will hear it in many forms, is that the world before the early modern period was different from the world we have been told about. There was a continental civilization, or perhaps a network of civilizations, that left behind cities, infrastructure, and architectural achievements that have since been buried, repurposed, or denied. The official story tells us that the Americas were sparsely populated by tribal cultures until European arrival. The unofficial evidence scattered across mining reports, old newspapers, anomalous archaeological finds, and the memories of men like Ellis Cardew suggests something more complicated. It suggests that there was something here, something older, something that was buried, in some places by ice, in some places by sediment, in some places by the deliberate construction of new cities directly on top of older sites, and that the institutions of the modern world have a strong incentive to ensure that the older sites are not investigated, not reported, and not believed. Cardew, in his recorded interview, said something near the end that stayed with Lebrun for the rest of his life. He said he had thought for many years that the columns he saw in the chamber beyond the wall were ancient. He had assumed they were old. He had assumed that whatever civilization had built them had vanished long before the salt deposits had formed around their structure. But, he said, in the weeks after the discovery, when he was lying awake at night thinking about what he had seen, he had begun to wonder if that assumption was wrong. He said the columns had not looked weathered. The grooves in them had been crisp. The doorway he had seen at the back of the chamber had looked finished. He said it had occurred to him that what he had seen was not a ruin. It was a building, an intact building, sealed inside the salt, as if it had been there, complete and undisturbed for however long the salt had been there. He told Lebrun that he did not know what to make of this. He said it was not the kind of thing a salt miner from Detroit was supposed to think about. He said he had no theory. He had only the memory of standing in front of a gap in a wall, looking through it with his light, and seeing 2 rows of columns in the front of a building, and feeling that he was looking at something that should not have existed at all. Lebrun, in his notes from that interview, wrote a single line at the bottom of the page that reads, "In his handwriting, This story is the kind of thing that gets a man killed if anyone takes it seriously. 2 months later, Cardew was dead. The fall, according to the police report from Dearborn that February, had occurred in the bathroom of his apartment. There were no witnesses. There were no signs of forced entry. The case was closed within a week. The Detroit salt mine is still operating. It is owned now by a company called the Detroit Salt Company, which is a subsidiary of a larger industrial group based out of Kansas. The mine produces road salt for the upper Midwest. It hosts occasional public tours. The lowest chamber, according to all available company maps, does not exist. There is no listed elevator that reaches that depth. There is no record of any inspection of any decommissioned chamber. In the spring of 1976, the 4 men who Cardew said had descended that day, including himself, have no shared documentation that they ever did anything together. Hennig is dead, Kohler is dead, Ullman is missing, Cardew is dead, Lebrun is dead. What remains is a recording in a private archive and the memory of a man who, for one afternoon in 1976, looked through a hole in a wall and saw something that the official version of American history has no place for. He kept the secret for 31 years. He told it once, and within 60 days he was gone. There are people who will tell you that this is a coincidence, that an old miner at the end of his life told a colourful story to a sympathetic listener and then died of a fall in his apartment, and that the timing means nothing. That every alleged anomaly in every alleged sealed chamber across the Midwest can be explained by individual misperceptions, by industrial debris, by the natural human tendency to dramatize the underground. These people may be right. Coincidences happen. Memories distort. Stories grow. But coincidences, when they accumulate in the same direction across 100 different locations and 100 different decades, stop looking like coincidences. They start looking like a pattern. And the pattern in this case points consistently toward one conclusion. There is something underneath this country that is older than the textbook says it is. There are people who have seen it. There are companies and institutions that have actively suppressed the reports. And there are dead men, and missing men, and forgotten men who tried to tell the truth before the system caught up with them. Ellis Cardew was the last salt miner who walked the lowest chamber under Detroit. He came back. He worked another 28 years. He retired. He spoke once in a diner in Dearborn to a historian who knew how to listen. And then he was finished. The mine continued operating above the chamber he had described. The company continued issuing tour brochures. The official record continued to describe a routine industrial site with no anomalies, no sealed corridors, no inscribed columns, no buildings inside the salt. The rest of us are left with the recording and the wall and the question of what is still down there, because nothing has been removed. The chamber has not been excavated. The wall has not been opened. Whatever Cardew and his crew saw through that gap in 1976 is still sitting 1,200 feet below the streets of Detroit, surrounded by the salt of an ancient sea, waiting. And the only people who know it is there are the ones who refuse to forget that one old miner sat down in a diner one afternoon and decided, after more than 3 decades of silence, to finally tell somebody. If this is the kind of investigation you came here for, the kind that the official record cannot accommodate and the institutional powers cannot afford to confirm, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with somebody who will not look away from a question that the textbooks will never answer. We have more of these stories. There are more sealed chambers, more silenced witnesses, more anomalies in the record that the standard explanation cannot cover. We are working through them one at a time. The lowest chamber under Detroit is one piece. The next piece is already being prepared. The official story is not the only story, and the more of us who remember that, the harder it becomes to bury the next miner, and the next wall, and the next building inside the salt.